Hey everyone, welcome to the Adopted podcast. This is my first podcast on LinkedIn, and I'm pretty excited. And today I have with me someone you would all love to meet. His name is Raphael Danilo, and Rafa has been a product leader. He's built companies. He had his own company in the past, which he had sold to Gong. He's a product leader in Gong right now, and also a VC. Without giving much detail, Rafa, could you welcome on board, and would love to hear a little bit more detail about your introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Deepak, for having me. As you said, what's a little bit unusual about my background is I'm both an operator and a VC at the same time. So my background is I started a company called Yobs out of college that I run for 6 years. Company was venture backed, and the easiest way to describe what we were doing is we were essentially doing what Gong does, but for recruiting teams. So we built one of the first AI meeting assistants for recruiting teams back in 2017, 2018, partially to solve a personal problem that we had around, note taking and being able to focus during interviews, and then being able to align as a team on what does great look like during interviews. One of the things that we wanted to solve is if you interview a candidate and I interview a candidate, we might both think that they're great or terrible for different reasons, but we're not looking at the same data set. We're sort of just exchanging notes without knowing what questions you asked, how you answered those questions, etc. And nothing beats sort of looking at the game tape together to squash any of those misalignments. That's what we did, and we ended up selling that company to Gong back in 2022. I joined the team as part of the acquisition and was the GM of our recruiting product line for the first sort of 12, 18 months that I was at the company. And then the last 12 months, I've been focused on other new products, particularly Engage, which is our sales engagement product. So that's sort of what I do most of the day is building and operating. And then I invest through Dark Mode, which is a fund that I run with two partners who are also founders. One sold his company to Twitter, Amir Shavat. The other cat is still running hers, company called Vereto. And the three of us write roughly 100 to 200K checks in infra, dev tools, and broader SaaS companies.
Awesome. Very cool. I've not seen so many people check this investor, operator at a large company, founded your own company. So congrats on doing all of that at a very early age. I'm sure the journey wouldn't have been as easy as we make it sound. I'm sure you went through your ups and downs in the journey as well, Rafa. Could you talk us a little bit about, your first company, right? The company that you founded. You said it was an AI company in the HR tech space, and this was pre-generative AI era, right?
Yeah. This is back in 2017. Yeah, I mean, the reality is I don't know what I want to do when I grow up, so I'm just doing all three and seeing which one works. Half joking. So the first company that I built, Yobs, was in the HR tech space, and yeah, back when we were building, some of the building blocks were already there. So, for example, meeting transcription was already in a good enough spot that we didn't have to build it ourselves. The accuracy of the models was obviously not what it is today, but it was good enough that you could already build a product, especially if you fine tune some of those models with your own data set, which in our case was interviews, since that's what we recorded. On the other hand, there were other things that were much harder to do back then than they were now. And we probably spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars on solving. They're closer to, meeting summarization. So once you have a transcript, actually summarizing the key takeaways, identifying certain topics. So basically understanding what's going on in a conversation, and then using that to enrich or trigger different workflows. So that's something that I think in the last couple of years has become much easier to do. Like the tide has sort of risen, but back then we had to do a lot of that stuff more fundamentally.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. And you've seen the journey pre-Gen AI to post-Gen AI while doing your own startup, and a lot of things you've seen have become so simple in the generative AI world. I'm sure you carry forward some of those learnings into Gong, right? And when you joined Gong, and you've been there for a few years, could you talk a little bit about, how does Gong look at product adoption in general, and in any measures Gong is taking in AI to improve product adoption?
Yeah. So we we're sort of an AI, one of the first AI native companies, right? Like AI was always a huge part of Gong's DNA from day one. Gong started as effectively what we call a conversational intelligence platform. So, essentially recording conversations that B2B companies are having with their customers, transcribing those calls, and then making both the recording and the transcript and the key points available to both the rep, but also their managers. So one of the big primary use cases was coaching, right? But what we realized is a lot of what happens in those conversations is really, really rich information that often doesn't make its way back to the CRM. So of course, there's one use case, which is, summarize some of those key points and automatically update the CRM. But the other piece is, since the CRM is sort of fundamentally not architected to capture and understand some of those conversational data points, the sort of the next act for Gong is leveraging that massive data set of conversations and other customer interaction data points that we sit on to, do a better job at certain workflows, certain modules that you would typically do somewhere else. So great example is revenue forecasting. Generally, you'll have a sales rep that puts in a number at the end of the week, at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter that says, hey, this deal is in commit. And generally, a manager would sort of ask some questions and validate whether this is indeed best case or most likely whether you should push it out to next quarter. But now AI, if you're sitting on top of all these conversations, we're able to tell you like, hey, actually, this deal shouldn't be in most likely or commit because your champion, your executive sponsor hasn't replied in 3 weeks. And when you look at historical data, that's not a good sign that the deal is going to close. So you're now able to do these things looking at, millions and millions of data points that previously would have taken, a ridiculous amount of human work. And then now you're able to sort of build some of these modules in a much more thoughtful, useful way for the end user. So that's, mentally we use AI at the core of what we do, but even internally in the way that we sort of improve our own processes, there's a lot of areas that we can talk about. I think namely capturing account context with AI, right? Like we sort of drink our own champagne at Gong where, we record pretty much all of our customer calls minus some exceptions. And so if I'm, jumping on a call, as a product leader, to maybe chat with a customer about the roadmap or maybe answer some questions about how we're differentiated from competitors or telling them about a new product that we're launching, I'm able to really quickly go in and sort of, we have what's called an Ask Me Anything feature. I can just ask the AI, like, hey, like, tell me about this account. Like, who am I talking to? How long have they been using the tool? What tool were they using before? How's adoption looking? So I'm able to ask some of these questions and get really, really fast answers without even having to bother the CSM in some cases. So that's just like one of several use cases for how we use AI to drive adoption internally.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think you touched upon external end user customer use cases, internal use cases. So it looks like Gong is using AI across the board. The way you described it, it felt like it's not just making the job of the reps easier, sales reps, but also their managers, right? So they don't have to go and ping each rep and ask for the forecast or ask for meeting summary. All of that is inherent. So do you, just a follow-up question to that. So when you look at SaaS applications in general, and Gong is also one of them, applications had a bunch of feature functionality built in for humans to kind of navigate and use. Do you see the next phase of all these applications going to be that we will embed AI natively within the application wherever we can, or we would even become like an AI first application in the long run? Where do you see, like, what do you think is happening in the application space in AI?
Yeah. I mean, I can speak to how we approach some of these problems and where it makes sense to lead with AI versus be a co-pilot versus, sometimes not leveraging AI at all. I think there's certain tasks that are redundant and repetitive, and as long as they're done reasonably well, the end user would rather have an AI take care of them. In general, the jobs to be done that fall into that bucket are things like data entry, administrative work, updating systems of record. And so there we do a lot of automation where, the rep maybe still has like the last round of approval and they're sort of the approver rather than the core contributor, but will do the whole sort of summary and prepare the data entry for them. And they just need to click a button that says, yes, confirm, update the CRM with this information, or they can edit the information if they, feel like it needs to be described differently. So that's really useful, for example, for Medic, right? If you need to input Medic information or whatever other sales playbook your sales team is using, like after a sales call, like a discovery call, Gong will automatically generate the MedPick field, like the answers for each of the fields. And you just need to click a button and it'll update, right? So I think that's the type of chore that we feel pretty comfortable going really deep into the automation sort of vector. With others, it's more of a collaboration between the person and the AI. For example, generating a follow-up email after a meeting, right, is something that we do where based on the transcript of a conversation, you can just click a button and it'll generate a follow-up email, like generated by AI using the key points, right? So using the next steps that we're mentioning, using the key problems and key solutions that were sort of described. The AI is pretty good at discerning like what's important, what's not important, because we know the type of conversation that this is. We know this is a sales call or a customer success call. So it's pretty good at generating the follow-up. But then, like the user may want to use a different tone, or, maybe they covered XYZ topic in a different conversation, so they don't care about having that in the follow-up. So then it's much more of like a canvas that the user can sort of then collaborate with. And so there, the UI needs to be a little bit different as well. And so there's kind of, I would say, different layers of automation that we look for when we're ideating on AI features.
Awesome. And I was just, when you were talking, I was just drawing a parallel to my journey. And I had sold my company to 6sense, which is also in the sales tech space. And 6sense, I was responsible for some of the AI implementation back there. And we were doing something very similar, right? We were like, like 30-day summaries of what happened in an opportunity or in an account. Being an intelligence company should be easily available with the click of a button, right? And then forecasting like where the opportunity would go and stuff like that. A lot of stuff that would take tons of research time would just be automated. And I think you talked about the human element where you want to elevate humans to kind of doing more strategic value-added tasks and give prompts to AI and get the output they need. So I've seen like that phase of 6sense too, where they were thinking very, very similar. And I think we both share the fact that we both built companies pre-Gen AI era, and then in the new companies, we were kind of like working on Gen AI initiatives. So it's pretty cool. Do you think, like, let me ask you a controversial question, Rafa. Do you think with everything that you're hearing in AI, right? Like people talk about agents, AI teammates, AI co-pilots, there's a ton of AI language being thrown at this point, right? So there's kind of like an overload of AI happening at this point. So how do you think like SaaS applications in general need to think of their own application? You may have answered bits and pieces of it, but where I'm going towards is, should SaaS applications think of building co-pilots or agents with an app? Or should they even think of like going one step further and saying, no, I'll build an AI employee or AI co-pilot or a team member that kind of does a lot of tasks in application and even outside applications, right? So what is your sense? And we all could be wrong in the long run, but at this point in time, based on what you're seeing, what do you think is the trend here?
Yeah, I'm long-term bullish and short-term skeptical. And I would recommend to most buyers of agents and broader software to probably take a similar approach. And what I mean by that is, I think I like to think, for example, of the booking travel use case. Like if you think about the job to be done of booking travel, there's been a lot of talk about whether AI agents can do a good job there. And so of course there's like the primitives of that application that you would need to build, like, being able to call the API of like a booking.com or a Skyscanner and like literally take the actions, on the browser, et cetera, that the user would need to take, and here will be taken by the agent. But I think there's a broader thing, which is, in this case, there's so many sort of assumptions or filters or criteria that you need to build into the experience. And I'm not convinced that an AI agent that is sort of pre-programmed is always sort of like the best experience, especially if in this case, like you might have some visuals that you need to have, or actually in some cases like a drag and drop and click interface is actually faster than a conversational sort of agent interface. And so I'm skeptical about AI agents for everything. I think it's going to one type of tool that you can add to your armada, to your arsenal as a product leader. But I don't think we should slap chatbots and agents on every problem. I think it's a little bit of a hammer, once you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Like I think it's a little bit of that. I think in a lot of cases, you'll find that a dashboard or a great visual or a great drop down menu might not be as sexy as an agent, but in some cases, I think it'll be as valuable. And I think the best product teams will have sort of a framework for when to use which.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, back in the day before graphical user interfaces, right, which you're referring to, we used to have command line interfaces where things were like pretty complex. And then we got UI designers, UX folks built like pretty classy applications. And now we're kind of going back to like conversational interface, maybe not command line, but conversational interfaces. But I do agree with you that not everything can be conversational, right? Maybe the simple, repetitive, monotonous tasks, right? Like you said, booking tickets or stuff like that, easy tasks or repetitive tasks should mostly be automated or agent-driven, maybe, perhaps. And there are things where you will want to look at the app, where you want to dive deeper and figure out stuff yourself, right? So, yeah, I think that's a good point that you mentioned.
Yeah,
Raphael, I want to move to your third part, the third part of your. Yeah, sorry, go on. Were you saying something?
I was just gonna say, like if you take the booking travel use case, it's like how is the AI agent gonna gather your preferences around like you prefer an aisle seat versus a window seat, or you want an early flight versus a late flight? You want you want to add luggage or not? Like there's all sort of these different criterias, and I'm not sure that the experience is necessarily better trying to pre-program a lot of this versus being able to program at least like flags or alerts where the agent is going to know when to ask versus when to assume. I think there's a lot of complexity and logic there just with, and this is just one type of agent, right? I think this is just like one layer of complexity. And if you abstract away to like all of the different workflows that a modern, B2B company has to run, I think very quickly beyond the obvious, accuracy, security concerns that I think have been discussed pretty heavily about AI agents and their reliability short term. I think there's like a less discussed point around orchestration of agents and where is that orchestration going to take place, especially if those AI agents, you have the expectation that it's going to take action in other tools than just your SaaS app. I think there's sort of an implied axiom there or hypothesis that there's a place where you're going to be coordinating and orchestrating these agents, and it cannot just be in your app, right? Because it's going to be taking actions and interacting with other tools. So I think there's not as many questions there, but I think as the adoption and usage of those tools becomes more pervasive, we'll find ourselves having to answer those questions.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how these, AI team members, how will that space evolve? Because eventually, like today, humans need applications to get some tasks done. Applications simplify different outcomes for humans, right? So my presumption is you might still need applications, right? It's just a different way to access applications and get stuff done, but you might still need that in the AI world. You can't entirely live without applications at all. So you touched upon an interesting point, Rafa. You were talking about security, privacy, I think accuracy concerns, right? Like you just hinted on that in AI. I'm sure as a product leader in Gong, you must be evaluating a lot of AI tools who come and pitch to Gong and to you, right? Saying, hey, we do this, we do that. So what are some of the roadblocks that you see, like when enterprises as big as Gong are trying to look at AI solutions and see whether they want to adopt it or build in-house, build versus buy decision? So what are some of the decisions that happen internally and some of the roadblocks you see for smaller companies?
Yeah, I think to sell into a company like Gong, I think there are the obvious requirements around security, like are you SOC 2 compliant? Do you have like ISO 9200, etc. And so I'm going to do a quick plug for one of my portfolio companies, Drata here. Like there's companies like Drata that'll help you automate your compliance on those elements so that you can sell into a company like a Gong. So that's sort of like minimum requirement, whether you're an AI software vendor or whether you're a traditional software vendor. But I think beyond that, one of the things that we look for is whether a vendor is able to articulate what our problems are almost better than we're able to articulate our own problems. And I think
Mhm.
this is sort of counterintuitive because usually when you think of a sales process, you think about discovery and sort of like the customer knows what their problem is, and you just need to sort of like get them to articulate it, and then you can pitch your solution. But I think the best vendors come with a point of view, and they're able to ask the right questions, sort of almost as if they knew your problem before you even have to articulate it to them. And of course, that's a high bar, but that's what you're competing with. And you get there by obsessing over the customer, completely understanding what are their different workflows, what are their different pains. You're able to come up with that point of view, and you're almost educating the buyer on how to buy your software and how to evaluate it. Because invariably, like they're gonna have that question of how do I make sure this thing works? Am I the first customer who buys this? How do I roll this out? How do I do change management? And so the more you can lay that out for the customer, I think the better. And so one of the things that we do, for example, when we sell Gong is like we might do not just a demo, but we might do like a short pilot with a customer, or we'll lay out for them exactly before they ever implement the tool or sign a contract. We'll lay out to them exactly what the rollout process will look like, right? Like how are we going to train the trainer so that you can then go and train your teams. What does the timeline look like? What kind of training resources are you going to have access to? Who do you go to when you have an issue? Like, what does your support sort of look like? I think those things are sometimes as important as securing a champion and making sure that you have budget and meet the security requirements, which are sort of like the basic prerequisites. But I think it's like necessary but not sufficient to getting a deal
Yeah.
done.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you think enterprises have crossed the bar of accuracy with respect to generative AI, right? There used to be a time where AI was, even today with 4.0 and other models coming in place, they're 70-80% accurate. Like, they hallucinate. And then you can fine tune and make accuracy a little bit better. You can deploy some other things, RAG, etc., make it a little bit better. But there's still this gap, right? Like where they're not 100% accurate. And so if you deploy it for mission critical things like healthcare, or there's some industries where it's also very risky to deploy if you're not 100% accurate, but at the same time you can caveat it out. But in B2B SaaS, if you were to talk about it, have enterprises crossed the barrier, and are they okay adopting tools that may not be 100% accurate in terms of generative AI technologies?
Yeah. I think it depends on the company, and it depends on which is an annoying answer, but it depends on the company and it depends on the use case. I think what we're seeing is even some of the largest Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies in some of the most regulated industries are now adopting AI for use cases that are actually like quite sensitive and mission critical. I'll give you an example. Like JP Morgan recently announced that they're going to start, or they might have already started recording a lot of the customer facing calls that they have, and then using basic versions of AI to transcribe and summarize those meetings. And I think that, I mean, if one of the largest bank, if not the largest bank in America is crossing that chasm, it sort of gives you a sense of where we are in the adoption curve for that type of technology. If you thought about it 10 years ago, most calls are going to be recorded, transcribed, summarized by AI. It would have been kind of crazy. I can tell you in the recruiting space, so the very, very first design partners that we would talk to in Fortune 100 companies thought it was crazy. And then now recording interviews is almost the norm for most tech companies. So I think these things evolve. And I think for certain, some of these use cases where the value is extremely clear, especially in a remote environment, recording calls, making that game tape available to the right people internally, of course, with the right privacy and consent measures. I think we're seeing appetite there, even from some of the companies that are generally later adopters.
Mhm.
And then I think for other use cases, AI agents being a great example, I think customers are approaching it with a healthy amount of skepticism. And I think, some of the early customers will potentially get burnt by some of those technologies. And so it's reasonable for some of these companies that have been around for a very long time, and AI agents is not the first new technology wave that, is sold to them as the next gold rush that they see. And so before that, it was blockchain, and before that, it was something else. So I think they approach all of these new technology waves with a healthy amount of skepticism.
kind of reminded me, as we were talking about the AI wave, kind of reminded me of the cloud wave. If you remember at that point in time, back in the early 2000s, people were like, there are a few cloud companies, but most large enterprises were very skeptical of giving their data into a cloud that is hosted by somebody else, right? There were tremendous privacy concerns. Now it's kind of like become a norm, unless, there's virtual cloud, there's hybrid, there's all kinds of cloud right now, but it just became accepted in enterprises that it's okay to deploy on somebody else's AWS as your GCP. So even today, I see like crossing the chasm, as you said, with AI, where, oh, my data is going out, but there are ways to kind of mask the data, secure from a privacy standpoint. There's ways like where you can either self-host or deploy in somebody else's AWS. So I think, I kind of agree with you. I think companies are slowly beginning to cross the chasm. The earlier adopters will take the risks, and the late ones will come. So moving on to the third part of your experience, Rafa, you have been an investor. Dark Mode VC is your venture arm, right? And looks like you've been an investor for 3+ years, so sticking with it. So can you talk a little bit about that journey, specifically with respect to generative AI, and what are the kind of companies you have been seeing? Or what is your investment thesis like when you look at companies in that space?
Yeah. Yeah. So AI, of course, is a theme that we're particularly excited about. With dark mode, me personally, I've been angel investing even before dark mode in AI SaaS companies for the last almost decade, I think, since like probably about 2017, 2018. So a little less than a decade. Back then, it wasn't Gen AI wasn't the phase, right? It was big data, and then it was deep learning, and then it was active learning, and so on and so forth. So there's been kind of different generations and different opportunities at different points in time. But I think right now, of course, we're intimately aware of some of the opportunities in Gen AI and more broadly. I would say like a couple of areas that we're particularly excited about. I think one is, of course, go-to-market tech. And that's also where we bring a stronger point of view. And we look at go-to-market tech as, of course, you have like the sort of the AI SDR use case, which is making a lot of noise right now. But more broadly, like, marketing, CS, sales engineers, right? So like being able to democratize some of the really technical knowledge that oftentimes very expensive resources internally have, and how do you democratize those for reps and CSMs when they need it in a more cost-effective way for the company? So how do you help an S team scale, for example? How do you help a support team scale or a CS team scale? And so all of those things are areas that we're particularly excited about, especially in this broader macro environment of like having to do more with less. So I think we're excited there. But I think another really big area that we're looking at is how is AI transforming software development itself? And that's potentially an area with an almost unlimited TAM. So of course, like that's particularly exciting for us. But when you look at AI Copilot tools like GitHub Copilot or Tab9, which we're an investor in, Copilots are already pretty much pervasive in developers' life. Like if you ask any developer friend of yours, it's extremely likely that a significant percentage of the code that they write is generated by AI. And of course, they have to check it and a variety of things, but it's one of those fields where AI copilots are already sort of widely adopted. And so as a result, the question we ask ourselves is, what are the second order effects of AI copilots becoming pervasive when you zoom out and look at the entire way that teams build software products? And so you might imagine that like, if it becomes 100 times easier to generate code, well, you need to make sure that you're able to keep up with QA and QA testing, and with DevOps, and with the way that you do release processes. And so what is the additional tooling that needs to exist to fill those gaps that get created as one of the pillars of software development, which is code generation, sort of explodes, right? Like the other pillars need to sort of keep up. And so we're always sort of thinking about what are those next areas, those next startups that need to exist. And then, we seek out exceptional founders that, want to go and build in those areas.
It's awesome. I mean, software development endless TAM, that was like what caught my eye. I actually saw a YC demo where person just told the AI to deploy a front end widget that changes to dark mode on an app, and then AI wrote the code, deployed it, and then he had to just start on the button. So it's fascinating what AI can do, supporting humans. And yeah, I think that space is pretty big. This is awesome. I think we've got a fairly good hang of like everything that we have done. Maybe just moving on towards like some advice, right, for startups who are starting up in the AI space. And we saw these waves, right? There was this wave where OpenAI and Mistral, all of them built foundational models. Then there was a cloud infra wave. Now people talk about AI applications, AI teammates, etc. Any suggestions, Rafa, that you have for anybody building in the AI space? Where does the opportunity lie?
Yeah. Um, I would say like one question that I always ask myself when I look at a new startup that is building sort of like an AI native approach to an existing space with incumbents is, what is my counter positioning advantage relative to those incumbents, right? And I'll explain better what that means. Like if I'm an incumbent, almost by definition, I already have distribution, I already have the data set, I already have the customers that trust me, are hopefully willing to buy more from me if I do a reasonably good job of positioning a new solution to them. So incumbents have a lot of advantages. And I think it's really important to ask yourself, like, how are you not a thin wrapper on top of GPT? And how are you actually delivering on workflows in a way that if the incumbents try to do the same, they would sort of have to disrupt themselves and almost cannibalize their own business, sort of like a innovator's dilemma situation. I think if you can identify a market that is reasonably large, where AI has a lot of potential, but where your entry point into the market is also a good counter positioning sort of play against the large incumbents, I think that's when you're really sort of onto something. So I think that's probably the first advice that I would have around what is the anatomy of a good sort of venture scale business to potentially go after. And the second is more around execution, is how to build a product that customers love. And I think there's probably three things that come to mind for me when I think about building a product that customers love. I think the first is having a really deep understanding of the user versus the buyer. And oftentimes those are different people, and understanding like, how do you generate value for each of them? And at different stages of growth for your business, you're going to find yourself investing in more in one versus the other. And I think doing that intentionally and making sure that you don't forget about one of the two as you scale, I think is really important. Naturally, if you underinvest in the buyer, you're not going to close deals. And if you underinvest in the end user, you're going to have adoption issues, and oftentimes that can lead to churn. And so, you really can't forget about either of them. The second is, building new functionality versus doing what you already do, but really well. So quality versus new functionality, I think, is kind of underrated in new product development. I think right now there's a race to build as much functionality as possible, which has also never been easier, because building software has never been easier. Like, we're abstracting away more and more of the complexity of shipping new tools. And so naturally there's an incentive to build as much as possible, but I think there's something to say about quality and craft of what you offer as a competitive advantage versus trying to do everything for everyone. And then lastly, I would say it's beyond product. I think building a product that customers love goes beyond the product manager and the engineers working on the product. I think you have to culturally orient the entire company towards creating raving fans and creating adoption. And of course, it starts with the engineers and the product teams working, and the designers working on building the product. But it goes to the sales reps positioning, the product to the customer, articulating what the product can and cannot do, right? So the expectation setting, I found, has a really high correlation with whether the customer is happy or not, down to, the sales engineering team that's qualifying whether the customer's workflows are a good fit. The implementation team, professional services, making sure that you're configuring the customer all in the right ways and flagging any risk to the customer success manager that's going to manage the ongoing relationship. And then lastly, like the CSM having an operating rhythm where they can be proactive with the customer and know, like, after 3 months or after 6 months, let me send you a note with specific insights or specific recommendations based on your usage and coming with a point of view to be this like strategic partner versus, just sort of waiting for the customer to come with issues and then being this more like reactive support system, which there is a place for it. But if you're only doing that, you're probably going to fall behind and not create raving fans relative to your competition. So I think that third point is probably the most important, is it's aligning all the teams and orienting your culture towards creating raving fans. So it's not just a CS problem or not just a PM problem.
So many golden nuggets there. Love everything you said. Build for disruptive workflows, craft in quality, and then create raving fans and buyer and user personas, focus on both. So much insight in that. One last question before we conclude. For larger companies or the more established companies, right, who have applications out there, what are some of the quick wins they get if they adopt generative AI in their applications? And what are some of the risks they face if they don't? Sometimes people are slow, right? What is the risk of waiting for a few years and not adopting generative AI?
Yeah. I think the risk, which is the obvious one, is shipping an AI feature that doesn't work well enough relative to the stakes of the job to be done. A great example might be like if you build accounting software and you try to use generative AI to fill in a bunch of the inputs to your balance sheet, and then your balance sheet doesn't balance because the Gen AI is hallucinating. That's a problem, right? Like your user will be pissed, and that's a high stakes job to be done that, unless you can, reliably get to 99.9%, if not 100% accuracy, Gen AI is probably not ready for prime time in that specific job to be done. But I think there's a lot of jobs to be done where there is an opportunity cost to not using Gen AI, right? And I'll give you an example. Like in our case, the core product of Gong originally was around recording conversation. And what happens when you record conversations is, well, there's the expectation that the user will go and watch the recording or read the transcript. But if a user is getting used to, the sort of the short form content and having AI summarize everything for them all the time, if you don't do that, then you're actually pissing off your user because the expectations of the consumer are changing. Whether you like it or not, they're changing underneath you, right? And so even though you might have provided them with a product that had a really high NPS, even up until 12 months ago, 18 months ago, the world is different today and the consumer expectations are changing. And so I would think of it in terms of opportunity cost. Mm-hmm. And what are you missing out on by not experimenting with some of that new functionality? And in our case, for example, providing really, really great transcripts and summaries and Ask Me Anything features, which was a relatively low lift for us to build on top of the infrastructure we already have. We found that it helps users get to the answers that they need an order of magnitude faster than before. And it just continues to contribute to people like loving Gong and telling their friends about Gong, where, some competitors that might have underinvested there are just barely sort of checking the box, which might look okay in a sales process, but it doesn't create raving fans. And I think you then miss out on the flywheel that comes from it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I remember when you're talking about this, I remember what Henry Ford said, like, if I would ask people what they want, they all want faster horses, and nobody said cars. So there's also this dilemma. You listen a lot to customers and what they want, but then something like an OpenAI comes up, which came up like a few years ago, and people sometimes have to see it to believe it, right? There's a little bit of that happening with generative AI too. So it's a fine line, and it's a tough problem statement to work with. But having said that, this was a fantastic podcast. Rafa, thank you so much for being my first guest on the podcast. Such amazing insights shared, and I hope like all the viewers learned from your experience. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.